The medieval European life. You think you know it? Forget the grand castles and the gleaming knights. This video will pull you into a harsh world where survival was a relentless battle against cold, hunger, and dangers lurking in the shadows. Every breath, every morsel of food, every layer of clothing was a secret to survival passed down through generations. You'll witness how flimsy wattle and daub huts became the last bastions against blizzards, how human bodies transformed into living furnaces, and how even dirt became a protective shield. Have you ever wondered how these peasants survived the most brutal winters when food ran out and death lurked just beyond their doors? This journey isn't just about scarcity. It's an epic ballad of human resilience, of secrets only ancient walls and forgotten ashes truly know. Do you dare to uncover these dramatic survival mysteries? Join us on an unprecedented adventure, and don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next profound stories, and comment below with your thoughts.
The very air became a weapon this afternoon, a howling banshee tearing at the fragile skin of your world. It wasn't merely cold, it was a malicious entity, a predator stalking through the skeletal trees that stood like ancient, gnarled guards around your small, forgotten village, nestled deep within the rolling, damp hills of Wessex. A sudden, brutal gust of wind ripped through your tiny mud and stick hut, a flimsy bird cage against the gathering storm, tearing at the crude animal hide you were desperately trying to patch over a gaping hole in the roof. Your fingers, already numb and stiff as winter branches, fumbled at the wet, frozen leather, each touch a bolt of agonizing ice that shot up your arm like lightning. This wasn't just a cold snap. It was winter's first cruel kiss, a chilling prophecy whispered on the wind, its breath a tangible, suffocating shroud promising months of relentless struggle. Every gust felt like a personal assault, rattling the thin walls of your no-insulation dwelling, making it shiver like a terrified mouse trapped within a crystal cage of frost. You could swear you felt the very air solidify around you, a frigid, suffocating cloak threatening to smother every last ember of warmth. This was no gentle descent into the slumber of winter, but a plunge, sudden and unforgiving, into the very jaws of oblivion. You, Elara, have carried the burdens of far too many seasons for your mere 25 years. Life, a harsh sculptor, has etched lines of worry around your eyes, deeper than any laugh line might have been. Your husband, Connell, a man whose laughter once echoed like summer thunder through these very walls, was claimed by the fevers of last spring, leaving you a widow, the sole trembling pillar of your small, struggling household. Now, as autumn bled into the grim hues of winter, you find yourself the reluctant captain of a tiny leaking vessel navigating an ocean of ice. Your son, Finn, a boy no older than 7 winters, was curled beside the dying embers of the hearth, a small, fragile knot of vulnerability, his innocent breathing a fluttering butterfly wing against the encroaching silence. And then there's Thorn, your aging uncle, whose eyes hold the wisdom of 100 harsh winters. He's the keeper of the forgotten stories, a human library of lost lore, the quiet strength that often outweighs the biting cold. The man whose hands, though gnarled like ancient roots, still possess the true art of tending a reluctant flame. He always said, "The first frost, child, is a promise, and winter always keeps its promises like a stubborn debt collector." His words, usually a source of calm, now carried the heavy weight of foreboding, a drumbeat of dread in your very soul. The last vestiges of light were rapidly fading, bleeding from the bruised purple sky like a slowly draining wound, leaving behind only shades of desolate gray and the looming threat of an absolute blackness that felt as though it could swallow your very spirit. Outside, the trees, stripped bare of their leaves, stood like skeletal sentinels guarding the encroaching gloom, their branches reaching like gnarled, accusing claws against the darkening canvas, shivering in sympathy with your own trembling body. You could almost hear them groan and protest as the wind whipped through their brittle limbs, a mournful song of impending doom that seemed to whisper your name. Smoke, thin and weary, struggled to escape the small holes in other villagers' rooftops, mere whispers of warmth against the vast, indifferent expanse of the world. It was a stark visual reminder that every hearth in this desolate valley was fighting its own quiet, desperate battle, each chimney a tiny, flickering beacon, a valiant defiance against a tidal wave of ice. You felt a wave of profound isolation wash over you, as vast and cold as the landscape itself. Inside your hut, the thin walls offered little more than a mocking illusion of shelter, a spiderweb of sticks and mud barely holding back the tide. You could almost hear a bird sneeze from outside, if birds were foolish enough to still be out in this unforgiving chill, a testament to how utterly permeable your supposed sanctuary was. There was no insulation, no comforting thick layers between you and the raw, biting air. It was like living inside a sieve, constantly being bombarded by invisible spears of ice. You pulled your rough, scratchy wool tunic tighter around your shoulders, but it was like trying to stop a charging bull with a piece of string. The small holes covered with animal skin were barely more than suggestions of windows, letting in only a dim, diffused light that seemed to drain the last vestiges of warmth from the room, leaving it feeling like a cold, damp cave. And as for a thermostat, the very notion would have been just as cruel as the winter itself, a cruel fantasy that belonged to the fanciful tales of distant kings and queens. Your home's inside temperature was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. A grim comfort, indeed, a microscopic victory in a monumental war. Nights were always the worst. As the last sliver of twilight dissolved into absolute blackness, a primal fear, ancient as the hills themselves, began its slow, relentless creep. Darkness swallowed everything, turning familiar corners into menacing shadows that danced with your own rising anxieties. The wind outside began to howl like an angry ghost, a relentless, mournful wail that seemed to penetrate your very bones, a song of desolation that promised no quarter. The fire in your hearth, already a pathetic flicker, sputtered pathetically, struggling to maintain its fragile hold on existence, doing its best, but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was fortunate enough to be sitting closest. The damp, earthy smell of the compacted dirt floor rose up, a constant, chilling reminder of the earth's icy embrace beneath your feet, a cold, damp hand reaching up to pull you down. You could feel the cold from below, a relentless, insidious presence seeping into your very core, a silent, unrelenting assault that promised to drain the very life from your body. This wasn't merely a season, it was a test of endurance that arrived with the brutal regularity of the tides, coming around every year like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances, delighting in finding your weaknesses. Every waking moment was a silent calculation, a desperate attempt to conserve what little heat your body could generate, a constant, invisible ledger being kept in your mind. Your family was already counting down the dwindling supply of firewood, each stacked log a precious, finite resource, a ticking clock against the encroaching cold. Thorn, with his weathered hands, ran a gnarled finger over the rough bark of a log, his gaze distant, as if weighing the very essence of survival, his face a map of past struggles. "We'll need to be clever, Elara," he'd said earlier, his voice raspy, dry as parched earth. "Cleverer than ever before, for winter knows no mercy. Only the strong survive its gauntlet." His words, usually a source of calm, now carried the heavy weight of foreboding, a leaden pall settling over your heart.
You knelt beside Finn, pulling the scratchy wool blanket higher up his chest, willing your own body heat to transfer to his small frame, a desperate offering to the cold. His breath, though shallow, was still warm against your cheek, a tiny, precious victory, a fragile flame in the vast darkness. But even that small comfort was fleeting, a ghost of warmth that would soon dissipate. You knew,
felt deep in your bones that this journey into winter had only just begun. The first frost was merely the messenger, a herald of doom, a harbinger of the truly brutal survival secrets you would soon uncover, or perish trying. The air in your lungs felt like tiny shards of glass, each breath a miniature wound, and you forced yourself to breathe shallow, slow, and most importantly, through your nose. This was survival breathing, a desperate attempt to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit your lungs, a trick taught to you by Thorn years ago, a whispered prayer passed down through generations. You'd always scoffed at it then, a carefree child unburdened by such grim necessities, but now it was a lifeline, a thin thread connecting you to existence. You stared at the small, flickering flame in the hearth, its light dancing like a hesitant ghost in the encroaching darkness, a lonely star in a vast, cold universe. It was doing its best, truly, a brave warrior against an overwhelming enemy, but its warmth barely reached beyond an arm's length, a mere suggestion of comfort. Your toes, despite being tucked under your body, were already losing feeling, turning into icy extensions of the frozen floor, deadweights dragging at your spirit. The very thought of frostbite was a gnawing fear, a grim reaper patiently waiting for its moment, its scythe already sharpened. You swallowed, feeling the dry rasp in your throat, a symptom of the stale, smoky air inside the hut, a constant reminder of the limited ventilation. This room, which was supposed to be your sanctuary, felt more like a fragile cage, barely holding back the ravenous jaws of the winter night, a whisper of a shield against a roaring tempest. As the wind intensified, rattling the crude wooden shutters over your non-existent windows like skeletal fingers drumming a warning, you heard a low, drawn-out howl in the distance, a wolf, or perhaps a pack, their voices a chorus of hunger echoing through the frozen landscape. The sound was like a chilling lullaby, a reminder of the wild, untamed forces that surrounded your small, vulnerable existence, a grim serenade that promised little rest. Finn stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, and you instinctively pulled him closer, your arms a desperate barricade against the unseen threats, a human shield against the coming dawn. There was no escaping the reality of it. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, a small triumph in a relentless war, a whispered testament to the power of pure will. You could almost taste the fear, sharp and metallic, mingling with the pervasive smell of damp earth, smoke, and the faint, acrid scent of animal hide that permeated everything in your home, a brutal perfume of peasant life. This story, this brutal journey, had just truly begun, and its first chapter was already written in the biting, relentless language of ice.
The first hint of disaster arrived not with a roar, but with a sinister drip, a sound as chilling as the grave. It was just past dawn, the air inside your tiny mud and stick hut still holding the raw, biting edge of the night's frost, when you heard it. A persistent, rhythmic plink-plink, like a blacksmith's hammering a tiny frozen anvil. Your eyes, still heavy with the exhaustion of a sleepless night spent shivering, snapped open, locking onto the dark, growing stain on the ceiling. It was directly above where Finn lay, a small, fragile bundle, his breath still soft and even. A tiny, crystalline bead of water hung precariously, reflecting the feeble light of the dying embers, before releasing its hold and falling directly onto Finn's bundled blanket, a cold, wet kiss of betrayal. Your stomach lurched, a sick knot of dread tightening in your gut. The flimsy straw roof, your family's only shield against the elements, had sprung a leak, and in this brutal cold, a leak was an open door to death. This wasn't just water. It was the icy breath of winter itself seeping into your sanctuary,
a breach in the fragile defense you had painstakingly built. You scrambled to your feet, the damp earthen floor biting at your bare soles, a sudden jolt of reality that was more effective than any strong brew. "Thorn," you whispered, urgently, your voice a raspy whisper against the silence. Your uncle, usually a deep sleeper, stirred, his eyes, two weary pools of ancient wisdom opening slowly to the dim light. He followed your gaze upward, and a sigh, heavy as winter fog, escaped his lips. The problem, as you both knew, wasn't just the water. It was the wind, the omnipresent, howling tormentor that had found its latest weakness, turning your roof into a perforated shield against its relentless assault. This was not merely a repair. It was a desperate race against the clock, a battle for survival before the small drip became a deluge of frozen misery. Your home, a testament to sheer willpower and ancestral knowledge, was largely a product of wattle and daub construction. Imagine, if you can, a giant woven basket. That's essentially what your walls were. A sturdy lattice of wattle, or interwoven branches, acting as the skeletal frame. This framework was then liberally coated with daub, a thick, unholy concoction of mud, clay, and, crucially, straw. And yes, my friends, often animal dung was mixed in too. Don't wrinkle your nose just yet. People whispered that this pungent addition was a secret ingredient, binding the mixture together with surprising strength and adding a layer of primitive insulation. The faint, earthy smell, mingling with the pervasive smoke of the hearth, was the unmistakable perfume of peasant life, a scent that clung to your very clothes like a second skin. It was crude, certainly, a far cry from the stone castles of the local lord, yet it was home, a fragile shell against a hostile world. But even the most diligently applied daub had its weaknesses. Over seasons of baking sun, driving rain, and especially the relentless expansion and contraction caused by frost and thaw, tiny cracks would appear, like spiderwebs of despair, growing subtly until they became gaping wounds. And the roof, oh, the roof! It was a masterpiece of simplicity, yet a constant source of anxiety. Thick bundles of straw, painstakingly harvested and dried, were layered over a timber frame, creating a thick, golden blanket that was meant to keep you dry and warm. But after a few seasons of harsh rain and heavy snow, it tended to turn into a leaky sieve, or, as Thorn often grumbled, a basket fit only for catching snowflakes. You'd seen it before, the slow, insidious deterioration, like an old man succumbing to age, piece by piece. "The wind's found another weakness, Elara," Thorn rasped, his voice rough with sleep and the cold. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an old tree, his gaze scanning the ceiling, pinpointing the precise source of the leak. It wasn't just a random hole. It was a spot where a section of the bundled straw had shifted, creating a direct pathway for the melting snow to begin its insidious journey downward. You knew, intimately, the constant battle against these invisible invaders. Every household, people whispered that, had a map of its own deadly weaknesses, a constantly evolving blueprint of drafts and leaks that shifted with every new storm. It was a secret language spoken between the wind and your home, a brutal dialect of survival. Your first task was to mitigate the immediate threat. You grabbed the largest, cleanest piece of old hide you could find, a stiff, brittle thing that crackled like dry leaves when you unfolded it. Carefully, you positioned it beneath the drip, directing the cold water into a small clay pot. The sound of the water hitting the pot became the soundtrack of your morning, a constant reminder of the fight ahead. Finn, now fully awake and sensing the urgency, watched with wide, curious eyes, his innocence a stark contrast to the grim reality. "Is the house hurt, Mama?" he asked, his voice small, a fragile bird's chirp. You forced a smile, a mask of calm over your churning fear. "No, my lamb, just a small cough. We'll make it well." The next step was to fix it, and that meant going outside. You bundled Finn tighter, leaving him huddled by the almost dead fire, safe with Thorn. Stepping out, the cold hit you like a physical blow, stealing your breath and biting at every exposed inch of skin. The world outside your hut was a study in monochrome. A vast expanse of white snow stretching to the horizon, broken only by the skeletal outlines of trees and the gray, heavy sky. The wind, no longer a mere whisper, was a howling banshee, whipping the snow into stinging flurries that felt like tiny, frozen needles pricking your face. Your hands, already stiff as frozen leather, felt impossibly clumsy as you began gathering supplies.
You needed more straw, thick bundles that would act as a new golden blanket for your roof. The straw pile, kept under a lean-to near the hut, was already half depleted. You plunged your numb hands into the brittle stalks, feeling the sharp edges scratch against your skin, the dust tickling your nose. Your breath plumed out in white clouds, like a ghost's sigh in the frigid air. Then came the search for moss, thick, resilient clumps that could be pressed into cracks, acting as a natural sealant. You scraped at the base of old, gnarled oak trees, their bark rough as an old man's beard, feeling the icy damp earth under your fingernails. The cold was a thief, steadily robbing your fingers of all sensation, making them feel like wooden clubs. The final, and perhaps most medieval ingredient for your daub mixture was the mud. But not just any mud. You needed mud that could be mixed with your precious straw, and yes, animal dung. The dung, usually from your family's small cow, was considered a secret component, binding the mixture together with surprising tenacity and adding to its insulating properties. You approached the small frozen dung heap with a sigh, the smell, though familiar, still causing your nose to wrinkle. It was a pungent perfume of peasant life, an aroma of desperation that clung to the very air. As you scooped up handfuls of the cold, clammy mixture, the very fibers of your being rebelled. The cold transferred instantly to your hands, a deep, aching throb that went straight to your bones. It was a primal, visceral experience, the kind that reminded you exactly how close to the earth you truly lived. Back inside, after what felt like an eternity battling the elements, your fingers were stiff and unyielding, like frozen sausages. Thorn, a silent observer and guide, patiently showed you how to mix the new daub, ensuring the consistency was just right, thick enough to cling, yet pliable enough to mold into every crevice. "It's like baking bread, Elara," he rasped, "but for our very lives." You scooped generous handfuls of the cold, clammy mixture, the straw pricking your skin, the unpleasant scent of dung a constant companion. You pressed it firmly into the cracks and gaps that peppered your walls, especially around the small holes covered with animal skin that served as your windows. These were the true weak points, eyes of the storm constantly searching for entry. You could almost feel the drafts receding, a small victory in the ongoing war against the elements. The most challenging part was the roof. Thorn, despite his age, insisted on clambering onto the low roof, his movements slow but sure, like an ancient spider climbing its web. You passed him bundles of straw, working in tandem. He would expertly tuck the new straw into the existing layers, weaving it in tightly, while you spread more of the daub mixture along the edges of the timbers, sealing every tiny gap. The wind, a relentless bully, tried to tear the straw from his hands, threatening to send him tumbling into the snow below. You held your breath with every movement, your heart a drumbeat of fear in your chest. People whispered that those who fell from their roofs in winter often met a swift, cold end, their bodies claimed by the snow before help could arrive. As Thorn worked, you noticed things you hadn't before. The walls, despite your best efforts, were a mosaic of old repairs, each patch a story of past struggles.
There was a section near the hearth where the daub was darker, thicker, a repair from the great blizzard 2 winters ago. Another lighter patch marked where a young tree had fallen onto the hut during a summer storm. Only these ancient walls truly knew how many times they had been patched, how many nights people had huddled inside, clutching to the fragile hope that their mud and straw would hold. Each repair was a desperate gamble, a quiet prayer whispered into the mud. Suddenly, a flurry of movement near the hearth caught your eye. A small brown blur darted across the packed earth floor, disappearing into a crack near the wall. A mouse. Then another, scurrying from under a stack of old tools. Thorn often joked about these paying guests, claiming they kept the spiders in check, but you knew they were a constant nuisance, gnawing at stored grains and spreading disease. Just last week, a robin had somehow found its way into the hut, a tiny disoriented flurry of feathers trapped inside, only to be shooed out by Finn, who thought it was a magical visitor. Your hut, with its numerous cracks and earthen floor, was a veritable highway for critters, a bustling inn for the local fauna seeking refuge from the unrelenting cold. "They seek warmth just like us," Thorn often remarked, his voice devoid of judgment. "And we are, after all God's creatures seeking comfort in a cruel world." As the afternoon wore on, a fragile sense of accomplishment began to settle over you. The new straw was tucked in, the daub was smoothed over the worst of the cracks, and the constant drip above Finn's sleeping spot had finally ceased. The hut, though still primitive, felt marginally more secure, like a ship after a battle, patched but still floating. You knew it was a temporary reprieve, a band-aid on a gaping wound. But in this life, every moment of respite was a precious gift. The air inside, though still smoky and smelling faintly of damp earth and animal dung, felt a fraction warmer, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift that was nonetheless a victory. This journey was long, and each step was a battle, but you, Elara, were learning to fight it with every fiber of your being, armed with nothing but mud, straw, and an unyielding will to survive. The sun, a weak, diluted coin, began its descent, promising another long, dark night. But tonight, you would face it with a slightly stronger roof over your head.
The enemy wasn't just outside, it was beneath your very feet, a silent assassin seeping through the porous boundary of your home. A shiver, colder than any wind, ran down your spine as you watched Finn, his small body racked by a dry, rattling cough that echoed like bones scraping on stone in the pre-dawn quiet. His face, usually rosy even in the depths of winter, was pale, his lips tinged blue. Thorn, who had been stirring the embers, straightened up, his gaze fixing on the boy with an intensity that pierced the gloom. "The earth's calling him, Elara," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper. "That cold, that damn cold, it's eating at him from below." Your stomach twisted into a knot, a cold dread blooming in your chest. The damp earthen floor, the very foundation of your existence, was not a friend, but a treacherous adversary, a vast, relentless sheet of ice that permeated everything, an invisible tide rising to claim your most precious possession. You knelt, feeling the brutal chill of the packed dirt seeping through your thin garments, a stark, undeniable reminder of your vulnerability. This wasn't just a cold floor. It was a gravestone in waiting, a constant conduit for the brutal ground frost to climb insidiously into every sleeping body. The air around Finn seemed to shimmer with an unseen chill, a veil of ice descending upon his small form. You knew, with a certainty that was both chilling and paralyzing, that this was the most dangerous enemy in your hut. A silent, unrelenting beast against which your meager blankets felt as thin as cobwebs. Finn's cough was a drumbeat of panic in your ears, a terrifying rhythm that threatened to shatter the fragile peace of your morning. You had to do something, anything to stop the insidious crawl of that freezing ground before it swallowed your son whole, just like a hungry serpent swallowing its prey. Your sarcophagus of a home didn't boast of stone floors nor sturdy wooden planks. No, your ground was the very earth itself. Packed dirt, hardened by generations of feet, worn smooth in places, but undeniably, brutally, part of the frozen landscape. It was cold, bone-chillingly cold, and in the depths of winter, often slick with condensation or even a thin sheet of ice where the outside chill pressed too close. Stepping onto it with bare feet was an act of masochism, a direct communion with the grave. The cold from the earth seeped into your body faster than a tax collector after harvest, bypassing any meager layers of clothing you might possess, burrowing deep into your bones like tiny frozen needles. You could literally feel your very marrow ache with the penetrating chill. Thorn, leaning against the rough wall, often claimed the earth was a jealous god, demanding its tribute of warmth, and that in the deepest parts of winter it would try to pull you down, a relentless siren call to the frozen depths. Your bed was hardly what a castle lord would recognize. It was a simple designated sleeping area, typically a slightly raised earthen platform or sometimes just a cleared space on the floor, upon which you spread your most vital defense: straw. Not luxurious, soft straw, but the coarse, dried stalks from the summer's harvest. It provided a thin, pitiful layer of insulation, a fragile shield against the earth's icy embrace. You often imagined it as sleeping on a gigantic, prickly cushion, a constant rustle and shift whenever you moved, a reminder of your humble slumber. Yet in this brutal environment, even this meager comfort was a blessing. People whispered that those who slept directly on the dirt without even a layer of straw rarely saw the spring. Their bodies claimed by the damp and the cold, their lives snuffed out like flickering candles. Seeing Finn's struggle, a fresh wave of primal fear washed over you. You couldn't stand by. You immediately began gathering more straw, frantic now, pulling it from the deepest, driest corners of your hut. Your movements were quick, desperate, almost animalistic, a mother bear protecting her cub. You threw it down, handful by handful, creating a new, thicker mound directly beneath Finn. The stalks scratched your hands, but you barely noticed, your mind a whirlwind of anxiety. You patted it down, willing it to be warmer, thicker. A magical barrier against the insidious cold that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. Thorn watched, his expression grim but approving. He knew, as you did, that every layer, every small effort was a desperate prayer against the encroaching darkness. You then pulled the thickest, coarsest wool blanket you possessed, a precious family heirloom, its rough fibers almost painful against the skin, and draped it over the new straw, creating a nest of desperation for your son. Now, let's talk about a secret. One that might make your modern sensibilities recoil, but one that was a brutal truth of medieval peasant survival. The power of dirt. In a world without heated baths, without endless supplies of clean linen, and certainly without the luxury of spare clothing, cleanliness was not a virtue to be pursued in winter. In fact, it was often seen as a dangerous folly. Your clothes, already rough and unwashed for weeks, even months, were a testament to this grim reality. The dirt, the dust, the dried sweat, the animal dander, it all accumulated, creating a surprisingly effective layer. It worked like a natural varnish, filling in the microscopic gaps in the coarse woolen fibers, turning your simple tunic into a crude but effective windbreak. It was, in essence, your medieval Gore-Tex jacket, only smellier, a testament to the ingenuity born from desperation.
People whispered that those who bathed too often in winter were more susceptible to illness, as if washing away the accumulated layers of grime also washed away some invisible shield against the cold. Your body's own natural oils, mixed with the layers of external dirt, created a protective coating that repelled moisture and trapped heat. It was a barbaric science, perhaps, but a science nonetheless. You might smell like a wild animal that had wandered into a peat bog, but at least you were warm. This acceptance of a lived-in look was a silent pact with survival. It was a compromise, a trade-off, comfort and cleanliness for warmth and life. A secret buried deep beneath the sands of time was the profound acceptance of this unseemly appearance for the sake of mere existence, a decision made not from laziness, but from sheer, brutal necessity. The constant itch beneath your layers of clothing was a living torment. The coarse wool, the accumulated grime, the occasional flea or lice that found refuge in your unwashed hair, it was all part of the unholy symphony of a peasant's winter. You found yourself scratching almost unconsciously, a primitive ritual of discomfort. Finn, too, would squirm and scratch, often making you feel a pang of guilt, wishing you could offer him the luxury of a warm bath and fresh clothes. But the thought was fleeting, a fragile fantasy that vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the stark reality of the present. The discomfort was a constant companion, a small price to pay for the preservation of life itself. Thorn, noticing your perpetual scratching, once chuckled, "Better an itch than a shiver, child. The lice keep you company when the fire dies." His dark humor was a bleak comfort, a reminder that things could always be worse. You knew the truth of it. The more layers of dirt, the better the insulation. Your clothes, once simple homespun linen and rough wool, became a canvas of accumulated grime, each stain a testament to a day's labor, each patch a history of survival. The heavy, shapeless tunic you wore was stiff with dried mud and sweat, almost like a second skin, a cocoon of filth that nonetheless trapped your precious body heat. When you moved, the fabric rustled, a whispering protest against its own stiffness. It felt heavy, cumbersome, like a suit of primitive armor, but it was the only armor you had against the piercing cold. And as for personal hygiene, that was a luxury reserved for the fleeting warmth of summer, if at all. The very idea of exposing your skin to the winter air for a wash was an absurdity, a death wish in disguise. The damp earth floor was more than just cold. It was a living, breathing entity. When the snow outside melted, or when a particularly heavy rain fell, the ground beneath your hut, already saturated, would often seep moisture directly into your living space. You could feel it underfoot, a slimy embrace, a chilling reminder of your proximity to the raw, untamed earth. Sometimes, in the morning, a thin film of ice would have formed on parts of the floor, a treacherous mirror reflecting the dim light, threatening to send you sprawling. This omnipresent dampness contributed to the constant, pervasive smell of mildew and earth, a heavy, cloying scent that clung to your nostrils and never truly left you. It was the smell of stagnation, of a life lived perpetually on the edge of decomposition, a tangible breath of the grave. Yet, amidst this discomfort, there was a strange comfort in the familiar. The rough texture of the straw beneath your back, the earthy scent of the daubed walls, the subtle give of the packed dirt floor beneath your tired feet. These were the textures of your existence, the unyielding realities that grounded you to this life. You were a creature of the earth, just like the burrowing animals that sought refuge beneath the frozen soil. Your very survival depended on understanding and adapting to its brutal rhythms, its unrelenting demands. Only the ancient earth itself truly knew the full measure of the human spirit that had endured upon its cold embrace, the countless generations who had slept upon its surface, battling the endless icy tide. As you moved about the hut, attending to the small tasks of the evening, you carefully avoided disturbing the newly laid straw beneath Finn. Every step was a careful calculation, a silent dance to preserve the fragile warmth you had just created. The fire in the hearth, though meager,
cast flickering shadows that played across the uneven walls, making them seem to writhe and undulate like living things. You were grateful for the darkness, for it hid the worst of the grime, the endless dust motes dancing in the dim light, a silent ballet of dirt. This chapter of your life, this relentless journey through winter, was defined by such harsh compromises, such brutal choices. And as you settled down for another night, the biting cold seeping through the floor was a constant, icy lullaby, a grim promise that the struggle was far from over.
The crisp morning air, still as frozen breath, was sliced by a sound that sent a jolt of ice through your veins. Rip! You'd been outside, gathering precious kindling from a fallen branch, when a jagged twig, hidden beneath a fresh dusting of snow, snagged the hem of your only wool cloak, tearing a long, ugly gash that ran nearly a foot up the side. Your heart plummeted like a stone into a cold well. This wasn't just a tear. It was a breach in your last line of defense, a gaping wound in your very armor against the relentless winter. The wind, a malicious ghost, immediately found the new opening, biting at your exposed leg with the ferocity of a starving wolf. A single, ragged garment in medieval Wessex was not merely clothing, it was a literal lifeline. And this sudden rupture felt like a direct assault on your very survival. A wave of despair, cold and heavy as midwinter fog, threatened to engulf you. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe, a direct challenge to your already precarious existence. Your hands, already numb and clumsy from the cold, instinctively went to the tear, trying to press the ragged edges together as if willing the fibers to mend themselves. But the damage was done, stark and undeniable against the dull gray of the wool. The thought of facing the rest of this brutal winter with a compromised cloak, your very skin exposed to the element's icy bite, filled you with a terror that surpassed even the physical chill. This wasn't about fashion. Medieval fashion, if you could even call it that, was a matter of grim survival, not mere aesthetics. Every stitch, every fiber of your clothing was a calculated defense against the pervasive, lethal cold that surrounded your life like a hungry beast. As you hurried back inside, cradling the torn fabric like a wounded animal, Thorn looked up from poking the embers. His gaze fell upon your ruined cloak, and a slow, knowing nod creased his weathered face. He understood instinctively the gravity of the situation. A peasant's wardrobe was a sparse affair, a collection of functional, coarse necessities, not a lavish display. You owned few garments, and each piece served a vital purpose in the desperate daily battle for warmth. Your day began not with choosing an outfit, but with a ritualistic layering, a sacred act of self-preservation. First came the rough linen undertunic, a scratchy garment that rarely, if ever, saw the blessed relief of a thorough washing. It was meant to be the base layer, absorbing sweat and preventing the coarser outer layers from chafing your skin, a second skin to your own. Then came a thicker, woolen tunic or undertunic if you were lucky enough to possess two. This was often a heavy, undyed garment. Its natural lanolin provided a degree of water resistance. Over this, you'd pull on a woolen overtunic or coat, often knee-length, providing another precious layer of warmth. Each piece was a building block in your fortress against the cold. Next were your lower garments. Breeches or hose made of thick wool or coarse linen extended to your knees or mid-calf, sometimes tied with simple drawstrings. They were often wrapped in lengths of woolen leg bands, creating a kind of medieval gaiter that provided extra warmth and protected against thorns and brush. And on your feet, shoes were a luxury, a rare sight for true peasants. You wrapped your feet in layers of old cloth scraps and rags, bundling them tightly before slipping them into simple wooden clogs or moccasin-like turn shoes if you were fortunate enough to have them.
The rags served as crude socks, absorbing moisture and providing a modicum of warmth, a poor man's insulation. If the cold still gnawed at your toes like tiny invisible rats, you'd add another scrap, stuffing it in until your feet were compressed, a tight, uncomfortable package. Finally, the great bastion against the elements, the wool cloak. This was your outer shell, your portable hut, often a simple rectangle of thick, fulled wool, sometimes lined with coarse linen or even scraps of old fur if you were exceptionally fortunate. It was your primary defense against wind, rain, and snow, a mobile fortress that you could pull tightly around you, retreating into its meager warmth. As you meticulously added each layer, you transformed, slowly but surely, into a human onion, each successive stratum adding a bit more precious warmth and, inevitably, a bit more pervasive itchiness. The sheer bulk of it made movement cumbersome, like trying to swim through thick mud, but the trade-off was undeniable. The rustle of coarse wool and stiffened linen accompanied every step, a constant whispering symphony of your bundled existence. The loss of a fully functional cloak was indeed a calamity. You spread the torn garment out on the packed dirt floor, the long rip a gaping maw in the fabric. This was not a quick fix. You needed to find scraps, durable pieces of wool or hide, and thread made from flax or nettle, sturdy enough to withstand the stress of wear and weather. You rummaged through an old wooden chest, a repository of forgotten treasures, pulling out a small pile of fabric remnants, a dark, faded piece of an old tunic, a stiff strip of tanned deer hide, a few lengths of coarse linen thread. Each was a relic of past necessity, saved against just such a day.
With a bone needle, a precious tool, you began the laborious process of mending. Your fingers, still stiff from the cold, moved slowly, each stitch a miniature act of defiance. You pierced the thick wool, pulling the rough thread through, joining the torn edges. The process was painstaking, your brow furrowed in concentration. As you worked, you recalled the constant struggle of keeping even these few garments relatively clean. Washing clothes in winter was a Herculean task, a chilling test of endurance. You'd have to break the ice on the river or the village well, your hands quickly turning numb and crimson with the biting cold, feeling like wooden clubs. The coarse, homespun fabrics absorbed the icy water, becoming heavy, stiff, and freezing to the touch. Then came the endless task of trying to dry them in the damp, frigid air, often indoors near the smoky hearth, where they dry slowly, taking on the pervasive scent of wood smoke, and often remaining damp and clammy for days, a constant source of discomfort. Clothes would often freeze stiff as boards on the line outside, becoming skeletal ghosts waving in the wind. The truth was, a certain level of grime was unavoidable, even desirable. The accumulation of dirt, sweat, and natural oils on your body and clothing actually contributed to your warmth. It created a crude natural barrier, a second skin of earth and toil that helped trap heat and repel moisture. It was a primitive waterproofing, a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, only smellier. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective solutions were the least appealing. People whispered that cleanliness was a luxury that could cost you your life in the depths of winter, as if washing away the accumulated layers of grime also washed away some invisible shield against the cold. Your body's own natural oils, mixed with the layers of external dirt, created a protective coating that repelled moisture and trapped heat, a barbaric science born of necessity. As you stitched, the rough wool grated against your skin, a familiar, perpetual itch that was almost comforting in its constancy. You'd grown accustomed to it, a minor discomfort compared to the gnawing chill that was always present. Finn, observing your focused work, asked, "Why do you always scratch, Mama?" You smiled, a weary curve of the lips. "It's the wool, little lamb. It keeps us warm, but it makes us dance a little." You knew the truth, the dirt, the occasional lice that found refuge in your unwashed hair. the constant friction of stiff fabrics, it all contributed to the pervasive itchiness that was a small, persistent torment in your daily life. Only these thrawn fibers truly knew the endurance of the human spirit they encased. Each worn thread, each visible patch, was a silent testament to countless hours of labor, battling the elements, pulling at the plow, weaving, mending, enduring. People whispered that every patch on a peasant's cloak was a story of survival, a tiny monument to a battle won against the cold, against hunger, against disease. They were scars of resilience, worn with a quiet, grim pride. Thorn often said, "A patch isn't a sign of poverty, Elara. It's a badge of honor. It means you survived another day when the Lord might have called you." By twilight, the patch was complete. It wasn't pretty, a rough, angular piece of faded linen sewn with thick, uneven stitches, a lump on the smooth skin of the cloak. But it was sturdy. It would hold. You slipped the cloak back on, feeling its familiar weight settle around your shoulders, a heavy embrace that promised both warmth and a constant reminder of your struggle. The new patch felt stiffer, a foreign body against your back, but the breach was sealed. You were once again as bundled as a human onion, layers of linen, wool, and hide, creating a protective cocoon against the encroaching night. The squeak and rustle of the fabric as you moved was the sound of your fortress, a constant reminder of your self-made defense. As Finn drifted off to sleep, his small body a warm weight beside you, you looked at the patched cloak, draped over a stool near the hearth to dry fully. It wasn't just a garment. It was a symbol of your unending fight, a banner of defiance against the brutal conditions of your life. This journey through the medieval winter was defined by such moments of quiet, desperate ingenuity. Every layer you wore, every patch you sewed, was a silent prayer for warmth, a stubborn refusal to yield to the cold's relentless embrace. You were living proof that sometimes the simplest, grimiest solutions were the most vital, the most necessary for survival in a world that offered so little comfort. And as the wind began to howl its nightly lament, you pulled your layered garments tighter, ready to face the long, cold hours ahead, wrapped in the brutal yet life-giving warmth of rags.
The world outside had become a howling void, a white, featureless expanse where the wind screamed like 1,000 tormented souls. But inside, a different kind of terror was unfolding, a slow, insidious chill that threatened to consume your very core. Thorn, the guardian of your hearth, the man whose every breath seemed connected to the vibrant life of the flame, lay shivering beneath a pile of coarse blankets, his face a pale, drawn mask against the gloom. His breath was shallow, rattling in his chest like dry leaves caught in a winter gale. "The fire, Elara," he whispered, his voice a fading ember. "You must keep it fed." Your heart constricted, a cold fist clenching in your chest. Thorn had always been the one, the steadfast hand, the priest of the flame, ensuring its constant, life-giving glow. Now the mantle of responsibility, heavy as wet wool, fell squarely upon your shoulders. The flickering glow from the simple pit in the center of your hut, your only beacon in the vast darkness, seemed to dim with his words, a dying eye in the face of the encroaching cold. Without that fire, without its constant smoldering heartbeat, your family, your son Finn, faced certain, brutal oblivion. This wasn't just about warmth. It was about life itself. You knew, with the certainty that was both chilling and paralyzing, that to let the fire die in the depths of a medieval winter was akin to throwing open your door and inviting death himself to step inside. It was an unspoken truth, a grim commandment whispered from generation to generation. The raw, desperate fear of failing, of seeing that precious light extinguished, was a cold, metallic taste in your mouth, far more potent than the actual chill in the air. You knelt by the hearth, the responsibility a crushing weight on your shoulders, and stared into the flickering,
desperate glow, feeling its meager heat as a direct connection to Thorn's own struggling life force. Your hearth was the true heart of your mud and stick hut, its smoldering heartbeat dictating the rhythm of your life. It wasn't a grand stone fireplace with a proper chimney like those you'd glimpsed in the Lord's manor house, where smoke gracefully disappeared into the sky like whispering prayers. No, your hearth was a simple pit dug into the packed dirt floor, often lined with a few stones to contain the embers. Above it, a hole in the roof allowed much of the smoke to escape, theoretically. In practice, however, it usually meant the entire room was perpetually filled with the haze of wood smoke, its acrid perfume clinging to your clothes, your hair, your very skin like an unwelcome second skin. People whispered that you could always tell a peasant from a mile away, not just by their rough clothes, but by the distinctive, earthy, and perpetually smoky scent that clung to them like a loyal shadow. Sometimes you felt like a piece of meat being perpetually smoked, an unwilling exhibit in some giant invisible smokehouse. The smoke was a constant presence, a billowing ghost that danced in the dim light, making your eyes water and your throat tickle. Yet despite its irritations, you tolerated it. It was the byproduct of life itself, a necessary evil that kept the greater evil of cold at bay. The hearth was the center of everything. It was your kitchen, where meager meals were cooked in rough iron pots, often simmering for hours, filling the air with the comforting, if monotonous, smells of thin stews or boiling grains. It was your only source of illumination, casting flickering, dancing shadows that played across the uneven walls, turning familiar objects into grotesque monsters or comforting figures, depending on the vagaries of the flame. And most importantly, it was your gathering place, the small, precious circle of warmth around which your family huddled, a tiny island of life in a sea of pervasive cold. With Thorn so weak, the sacred duty of keeping the fire alive fell to you. You moved deliberately, carefully, each action infused with a new, grave purpose. You broke off small pieces of kindling, dry twigs and bark, listening to their brittle snap as they gave way in your cold hands. The larger logs, precious beyond measure, were carefully chosen, their rough bark feeling like ancient skin under your touch. You placed them gently onto the dying embers, coaxing them to life, willing them to catch fire. The sound of the wood crackling and popping, a tiny celebration of warmth, was a constant comfort in the overwhelming silence of the long nights. Sometimes a spark would leap from the hearth, a tiny fiery insect dancing in the air before extinguishing itself against the cold, damp earth of the floor. The warmth the hearth provided was strangely localized. When you sat by it, your face might be flushed and sweating, a red beacon against the cold, while your back remained stubbornly chilled, as if the cold itself was an invisible wall you couldn't quite break through. You'd often turn slowly, like a spit-roasted animal, trying to expose every part of your body to its meager embrace. Finn, with his childlike simplicity, would sometimes press his entire body as close as he dared, absorbing the heat like a tiny sponge, his small sighs of contentment a sweet melody to your ears. This partial warmth was a constant reminder of the scarcity of heat, a teasing glimpse of true comfort that was always just out of reach. It was enough to keep you from freezing, but rarely enough to truly feel warm all over, leaving a persistent, ghostly chill lingering in your bones.
That night, with Thorn's breathing shallow and ragged, the task of keeping the fire became an obsession. You couldn't sleep. Every time a log settled, sending a shower of sparks like tiny shooting stars, you'd snap awake, checking the glow. The pervasive darkness beyond the small circle of light cast by the fire felt more menacing than usual, its shadows seeming to writhe and stretch like hungry demons. You fed the fire sparingly, cautiously, knowing that every piece of wood consumed was one less for the days to come. Your family's very survival was now measured in logs and embers, a fragile equation balanced on your tired shoulders. The wind outside intensified, its ferocious howl seeming to press against the very walls of the hut, testing their flimsy resolve. You could hear it whistle and moan through the small holes covered with animal skin that served as your windows, a mournful, chilling serenade that spoke of the desolation beyond.
The smoke inside the room seemed thicker tonight, a heavy curtain that made your eyes sting and your lungs ache. You coughed, a dry, hacking sound, and instinctively pulled your rough wool cloak tighter, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep through every pore. You imagined the smoke, a swirling spirit, dancing with the cold air, clinging to the rough fabric of your clothes, becoming one with the very essence of your being. People used to say that the smell of a peasant was the smell of their hearth, a unique blend of wood smoke, damp earth, and the pervasive scent of existence, a living signature on the fabric of the world. There was a strange, almost spiritual connection to the fire. It was more than just fuel and warmth. It was life itself, a pulsating heart in the brutal silence of the medieval night. People said that the flame in the hearth was not just heat, but the soul of the house, a delicate thread woven between life and death. To let it die was to sever that thread, to invite the ultimate silence. You found yourself talking to it in low whispers, coaxing it, thanking it for its warmth, for its light. It was a primitive communion, a deep-seated ritual that had been passed down through countless generations. This story, this journey, was one of perpetual struggle, and the fire was your constant, unwavering companion. As the night wore on, a profound weariness settled into your bones, heavy as stone. Your eyelids felt like lead, but you dared not close them for long. Every time the fire crackled, every time the wind howled, you startled awake, your heart a pounding drum against your ribs. You pictured the vast frozen landscape outside, the trees standing like skeletal giants, bearing witness to the silent, desperate battles being fought in every tiny hut. You knew that in other homes, perhaps even in those of your neighbors, similar struggles were unfolding, similar fears being confronted. It was a shared ordeal, a silent tapestry of survival woven across the desolate countryside. A secret buried deep beneath the sands of time was the chilling tale of those who had lost everything when their hearth fire went out on a bitter winter night. Not just the warmth, but the hope, the will to fight. They succumbed quickly, succumbing to the cold that, once invited in, became an unrelenting tyrant. You thought of old Gareth, who had lived 2 huts down, a solitary man whose fire had apparently gone out during the deep freeze 2 winters ago. No one had seen him emerge for days, and when the villagers finally broke down his door, he was found, cold and still, a frozen statue by his long-dead hearth. The memory was a chilling ghost that haunted your thoughts, fueling your desperate vigilance. As the pre-dawn hours approached, the air in the hut felt even colder, a heavy blanket of dread. The fire was now little more than a pile of glowing embers, tiny red eyes staring back at you. You reached for the carefully stacked logs, each one a precious, finite resource, and chose the driest, most promising piece. With utmost care, you placed it gently onto the dying coals, nursing it, whispering encouragement to the wood itself. You watched, holding your breath, as a tiny wisp of smoke curled upwards, then a faint glow, and finally a small, tentative flame, a fragile flower blooming in the darkness. A sigh of relief, deep and shuddering, escaped your lips, a prayer of thanks to the resilient heart of your home. The fire had not died. You had not failed. Not yet. And as the first faint hint of gray light began to pierce the small holes covered with animal skin that served as your windows, you knew this journey into the brutal winter would continue, one smoldering heartbeat at a time.
The cold clawed at your throat, a choking hand threatening to steal your breath even as the last precious embers of your fire seemed to gasp their final dying light. Thorn, still weak from his fever, stirred restlessly, his eyes 2 dim lanterns flickering open to meet your anxious gaze. "The fire, Elara," he rasped, his voice a whispering ghost, barely audible above the wind's mournful howl.
You must bank it. Tonight, more than ever, your life, Finn's life, it rests on those coals. A wave of panic, cold and sharp as broken ice, washed over you. Banking the fire, this ancient, intricate ritual, had always been Thorn's sacred duty, his personal alchemy. Now, this vital, life-sustaining art, a secret language spoken between man and flame, was suddenly yours to master or perish. The tiny pulsing heart of your home felt fragile, its very existence a desperate gamble against the encroaching darkness. Failure wasn't an option, it was a death sentence, written in the bitter script of the winter wind. You nodded, a silent, solemn vow to the dying light, your mouth dry with apprehension. The air in the hut felt impossibly heavy, thick with unspoken fears and the lingering scent of smoke. This wasn't merely about keeping warm, it was about preserving the very spark of life itself, a fragile beacon against the absolute, suffocating blackness of the medieval night. The idea of waking to a dead hearth, a cold, empty maw in the center of your home, sent shivers down your spine that had nothing to do with the external temperature. It was a chilling vision of true desolation, a grim premonition of the end. The art of fire banking was one of the greatest survival secrets of the medieval peasant, a whispered wisdom passed down through generations. It was a delicate dance between preservation and consumption, a ballet of embers and ash. Before retiring for the night, you meticulously arranged the dying embers, pushing them together into a compact mound, a tiny glowing mountain at the heart of the pit. You then carefully, patiently covered this precious core with a thick layer of fine, cool ash. This layer of ash acted like a blanket, a cunning insulator that would smother the flames, preventing the wood from burning too quickly, yet retaining enough heat to keep the coals alive, glowing softly and imperceptibly beneath their gray shroud. If done correctly, the banked fire would smolder all night, a dormant volcano ready to erupt with new life at dawn. Thorn, despite his weakness, guided your trembling hands. "More ash, Elara," he rasped, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Enough to bury the glow, but not so much as to suffocate it entirely. It's a delicate balance, like a mother nursing her babe, giving just enough, but not too much." You carefully sprinkled more ash, feeling its fine, powdery texture against your skin. It was strangely warm, a gentle memory of the fire beneath. The glow of the embers, once bright, began to dim, receding like a setting sun beneath a cloud of gray. You felt a pang of anxiety, a nervous flutter in your stomach. Had you put too much? Too little? This was your true test, and the stakes were higher than any harvest. The benefit of successful banking was immeasurable. Waking up to live coals meant you didn't have to face the excruciating, often fruitless task of making fire anew in the chilling darkness. Lighting a fire with flint and steel in the depths of winter, with fingers stiff and numb as frozen branches, was a test of will that often required more prayers than actual sparks. The steel would slip from your grasp like a greased eel, the flint would refuse to strike, and the tinder, usually dry moss or finely shredded bark, would often stubbornly refuse to catch, remaining cold and unresponsive as a stone heart. Many a peasant had wasted precious hours, their meager tinder exhausted, their hopes dwindling with each failed attempt, before finally giving up to the encroaching cold. People whispered that each family had its own secret recipe for banking the fire, a specific arrangement of coals, a particular depth of ash, passed down from parent to child. They would argue for hours over whose method was most effective, much like how modern folk might debate the precise formula for the perfect barbecue sauce. Only here, the stakes were immeasurably higher, for the outcome was not just flavor, but life itself. Thorn had always been proud of his own banking technique, boasting it could keep embers alive for a full day, even two if necessary. Now, that legacy rested in your inexperienced hands. As the last glow vanished beneath the ash, leaving only a faint warmth radiating from the hearth, a profound silence descended upon the hut. The wind continued its relentless song outside, a howling banshee against your fragile walls, and you found yourself straining to hear any subtle shift, any hint of light beneath the gray blanket. You pulled your layers tighter, trying to absorb every last vestige of the hearth's warmth. Sleep, usually a welcome escape, was now a dangerous proposition. Every rustle of straw, every distant creak of the hut made your heart leap, a nervous rabbit trapped in your chest. You lay awake for what felt like an eternity, listening to Finn's soft breathing and Thorn's shallow gasps, the constant rhythm of the wind, and the unsettling silence from the hearth.
Your mind raced, conjuring images of failure. What if the fire died? You'd wake to a hut as cold as a tomb, the breath misting visibly in the air, your fingers too numb to even attempt striking flint and steel. There would be no hot porridge for Finn, no warm water for Thorn's feverish brow. The thought was a chilling premonition, a ghost of desperation haunting your thoughts. The consequences were dire: weakened bodies, susceptibility to disease, perhaps even the slow, creeping descent into hypothermia, a merciful numbness that led to oblivion. It was a terrifying domino effect, all triggered by one simple failure, a tiny mistake with ash and embers. As the moon, a cold, indifferent eye, climbed to its zenith, you finally drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of ice and darkness. When the first faint hint of dawn, a gray whisper at the edges of your crude animal skin windows, finally arrived, you awoke with a jolt, your heart a pounding drum against your ribs. The first thing you did, even before acknowledging the aches in your own body, was to crawl towards the hearth. The air was still bitterly cold, a knife-edge chill that seemed to cut to the bone, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible warmth emanating from the pile of ash. With a trembling hand, you reached for a small charred stick. Your breath hitched in your throat, a frozen gasp as you began to carefully, meticulously scratch away the top layer of ash. Each scrape felt momentous, a moment of truth. Would you find a glowing heart beneath, or just cold, dead dust? The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one a tiny hammer blow on your anxious soul. The fine ash swirled in the dim light, like tiny ghosts dancing. Then, through the thinning layer, a faint reddish glow emerged, a tiny star winking back at you from the depths of the gray. And then another, and another. A wave of profound relief, warm and encompassing as the summer sun, washed over you. The embers were alive. Small defiant eyes of fire stared back from the pit, weak but undeniably present. You quickly yet gently placed a few small dried twigs onto the glowing coals. A wisp of smoke, thin and hopeful, curled upwards. Then a tiny flame, a fragile flower bloomed from the tinder, hesitantly licking at the wood. You added more kindling, then smaller logs, nurturing the flame, coaxing it, willing it to grow. The sound of the wood crackling and popping, a joyful chorus, filled the silence, growing stronger with each passing moment. The tiny flame grew into a small fire, then a larger one, casting dancing shadows that chased the gloom from the corners of the hut. You turned to look at Thorn, who had stirred at the growing warmth. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of your success. Finn, too, began to stir, sniffing the air. "Warm, Mama?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Yes, little lamb," you whispered, pulling him closer. "Warm, always warm." The relief was a physical burden lifting from your shoulders, replaced by a surge of quiet pride. You had done it. You had kept the flame alive. This journey through winter was a constant negotiation with the elements, a dance with death, where every step mattered. The art of firebanking wasn't just a skill, it was a testament to the sheer ingenuity and resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. Only the remnants of the cold ash truly knew how much hope, how much despair had been poured into them over countless generations. They were the silent witnesses to 1,000 battles, 1,000,000 desperate prayers. You knew that this was just one battle won in a long, arduous war, but as the warmth of the rekindled fire spread through the hut, pushing back the cold, you felt a surge of strength. You were a keeper of the flame, a guardian of life. And in this brutal, unforgiving world, that was the greatest title of all.
The wind outside howled like a hungry wolf, its voice a shriek of pure malice that tore at the very fabric of your hut. Inside, the meager fire, though diligently banked, offered little more than a flickering ghost of warmth. Then came the frantic hammering on your crude wooden door, a sound like death's own knocking. Your heart leapt into your throat, a wild bird trapped in a cage. You unlatched it, peering out into the swirling vortex of snow and darkness, and there, silhouetted against the blizzard's white fury, stood Ingrid, your neighbor, her face a mask of desperation, her son, Rolf, no older than thin, clinging to her leg, shivering like an aspen leaf. "Elara, our roof, it's gone!" she cried, her voice a raw, broken plea swallowed by the wind. "The storm, it took it, we have nowhere to go." Your small hut, usually a sanctuary of fragile privacy, suddenly needed to become a life raft for more souls, a desperate measure against the crushing might of the medieval winter. The thought of adding more bodies to your already crowded space was daunting, a puzzle with too many pieces, yet turning them away was unthinkable, a sentence of doom in this unforgiving night. Ingrid's eyes, wide and pleading, were two pools of terror reflecting the dim light from your hearth. Rolf, his small hands clutching his mother's rough tunic, looked up at you with eyes that were tiny, frightened stars. In this desolate world, community was not just a pleasant concept, it was a hard-won lifeline, a network of fragile connections that often meant the difference between life and death. You stepped aside, pulling them in, the blast of icy wind that followed them into your hut, a brutal reminder of the peril they had escaped. "Come, quickly," you urged, herding them towards the pitiful warmth of the hearth. The very act of welcoming them, despite your own scarcity, felt like a sacred duty, a silent pact against the monstrous cold. In the brutal embrace of a medieval winter, the very concept of privacy was a foreign, almost absurd notion, a luxurious dream for those who lived within the thick, insulated walls of castles. For peasants like you, individual space was a luxury you simply couldn't afford. When the cold reached its icy talons into every crack and crevice of your fragile dwelling, survival demanded a radical strategy. You piled together. Your entire family, you, Finn, and Uncle Thorn, and now Ingrid and Rolf, would simply huddle together in the warmest corner of the house, usually nearest the hearth. This wasn't a choice, it was a physical imperative, a desperate scramble for communal warmth. You would literally form a human lasagna, layer upon layer of bodies, each person contributing their own precious body heat to the collective warmth, a living, breathing furnace against the biting chill. The goal was simple: minimize exposed surface area and maximize shared warmth. Smallest children, like Finn and Rolf, were often nestled deepest within the pile, like tender jewels in the center of a crude, living jewel box, surrounded by the larger, warmer bodies of adults. The elders, like Thorn, might be at the periphery, their weathered bodies acting as an outer wall, a human windbreak,
shielding the younger ones from the most direct drafts. The sensation was immediate and profound. You could feel the warmth radiating from the person pressed against your back, the soft, even breath of Finn against your neck, the slight pressure of Thorn's elbow in your side. It was a dense, intimate closeness, a tapestry of flesh and warmth that bound you all together against the hostile night. The sounds of such a collective slumber were unique, a cacophony of desperate comfort. There was the pervasive rustle of straw as someone shifted, the rough material grating against old tunics. Then the rhythmic, often booming snoring of an adult, sometimes soft as a cat's purr, sometimes loud as a sawmill. Finn and Rolf would occasionally whimper in their sleep or emit small, sleepy sighs. You could hear the muffled thumping of a heart, the soft intake of breath, and the occasional small cough that seemed to echo disproportionately loudly in the close quarters. It was a constant symphony of human life, a choral testament to your shared struggle. And the smells? Oh, the smells. They were as intimately woven into the experience as the sounds and sensations. The overriding scent was that of human bodies, warm, unwashed, and deeply earthy. It mingled with the omnipresent smell of wood smoke from the hearth, the musty odor of damp earth from the floor, and the faint, unmistakable scent of animal hide from your clothing. If you were truly unlucky, as often happened, the smell of your livestock, brought inside for their own warmth, would add another pungent layer, the sweet, cloying aroma of animal waste and wet fur. It was a complex, overwhelming olfactory experience, a perfume of primal survival, a scent that clung to your very soul. You breathed it in, a constant reminder of your precarious existence.
As the night wore on, the initial relief of having Ingrid and Rolf safe quickly gave way to the practical realities of such close quarters. You were all packed together like sardines in a can, every limb touching, every breath shared. Finn, restless even in sleep, inadvertently kicked Rolf in the shin. Rolf, startled and uncomfortable, let out a small, indignant whimper, his tiny body stiffening like a startled rabbit. Ingrid stirred, a low growl forming in her throat, a warning rumble from a tired mother. You gently, swiftly, reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Rolf's leg, murmuring soft words. "Shh, little one, it's all right. Just sleep." It was a delicate dance, this maintaining of peace in such an intimate space, a constant negotiation of discomfort and shared vulnerability. Such minor conflicts were inevitable, tiny sparks in the great bonfire of shared humanity. People whispered that those nights of shared sleep had forged invisible bonds, stronger than even blood ties. For in those dark, cold hours, when the world outside was a frozen, unforgiving tomb, you literally gave a part of yourself, your warmth, your space, your very breath, to another. It was a profound act of trust and communal survival. These were not mere acquaintances, they became extensions of your own desperate will to live, facets of a single shared soul. The warmth of a human body pressed against yours was not just physical comfort, it was a psychological balm, a powerful medicine for the soul. The steady rhythm of another's breathing, the reassurance of their physical presence pushed back the oppressive loneliness that often accompanied the bitter solitude of winter. It was a reminder that you were not alone in this brutal fight, a silent affirmation of your shared humanity. This journey through winter was teaching you new definitions of intimacy, of family. It wasn't just the people you were born to, it was the people you huddled with, the people whose shivering you felt against your own, whose ragged breaths mingled with yours in the stale, smoky air. There were nights when you swore you could feel the subtle shift in Finn's breathing, the slight rise and fall of Thorn's chest, the tension or relaxation in Ingrid's muscles. It was a symphony of shared existence, each body a note in a desperate but beautiful composition of survival.
You thought of the grand halls of the Lord's castle, where individual chambers, complete with roaring fireplaces, offered insulated privacy. The very thought seemed alien, almost fantastical, a dream spun from moonbeams. Here, privacy was a luxury only death could afford. Life, raw and demanding, dictated and enforced closeness, a constant physical connection that, while often uncomfortable, was undeniably vital. Every twitch, every snore, every whispered word was shared, a transparent existence stripped bare of all pretense. It forced a raw honesty, a direct confrontation with the realities of human nature. You learned to ignore the small annoyances, to value the warmth above all else, to see the shared struggle as a binding force more potent than any social custom. As the night deepened and the temperature outside plummeted further, you could almost feel the collective heat of your human lasagna radiating outwards, pushing back against the cold that pressed in from every wall. The air closest to your huddled forms was noticeably warmer, a small, precious bubble of breathable air in the vast frigid expanse of the hut. The subtle scent of body odor, of sweat and damp wool, became oddly comforting. The smell of life itself, a testament to the fact that you were all still breathing, still fighting. It was a paradoxical comfort, born from a desperate situation, but comfort nonetheless. A secret buried deep beneath the sands of time was the profound realization that sometimes the simple, undeniable warmth of another living being was the most potent medicine for the soul. In a world devoid of soft beds, sweet scents, or gentle luxuries, the sheer raw heat of another body was a godsend, a sacred offering that transcended mere physical comfort. It was a psychological anchor, a silent promise that you were not alone in this immense, crushing darkness. As you drifted into a fitful slumber, nestled among your makeshift family, you felt the gentle rise and fall of Finn's chest, the steady weight of Ingrid's arm, and the distant rhythmic snoring of Thorn. The wind outside might howl its song of death, but inside, a different, quieter melody played, the symphony of shared warmth, a testament to the unyielding spirit of humanity in the face of medieval winter. This journey was far from over, but for tonight you had found solace and strength in the undeniable embrace of communal warmth.
The air in your mud and stick hut was already a thick, palpable blanket of cold, clinging to every surface, every breath. Then, a new, profound chill descended, not from the biting wind outside, but from the sudden, sharp downturn in Brunhilda's health. Your old cow, usually a mountain of sturdy comfort, was shivering visibly in the rudimentary byre outside, her breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps like a broken bellows. Thorn, his face etched with grim lines, knelt beside her, his hand pressed to her flanks, and a shadow, cold and heavy as a burial shroud, fell over his features. "She won't last the night out there, Elara," he rasped, his voice a death knell. "The cold will claim her, and with her, our future." Your heart seized, a fist clenching in your chest. Brunhilda was more than just an animal. She was the beating heart of your meager existence, a walking source of milk, cheese, and ultimately meat. Losing her meant not just hunger, but the slow, agonizing death of hope. There was only one impossible solution. She had to come inside, transforming your tiny home into a fragile ark against the brutal, encroaching winter. The decision hung in the air, heavy as winter fog, yet undeniably necessary. Bringing a cow, a creature of immense size and undeniable odor, into your already cramped living space was an act of desperation, a leap of faith into a realm of discomfort and inconvenience. But the alternative, watching your most valuable asset succumb to the elements, was a fate worse than any stench. You looked at Finn, his small face still pale from the previous night's cough, and the choice was made. Brunhilda was your lifeline, her very breath a promise of survival. You and Thorn braced yourselves, the grim task ahead feeling like moving a mountain with bare hands. For the medieval peasant, livestock were more than just assets. They were quite literally mobile furnaces. In a world without central heating, without chimneys that effectively drew away smoke, the sheer body heat generated by a cow, a pig, or even a handful of chickens was an invaluable, vital resource. Your mud and stick hut, already thin-walled and prone to drafts, was transformed by the presence of these creatures into a slightly warmer, albeit far more pungent environment. People whispered that on the coldest nights, families would huddle as close as possible to their animals, absorbing the warmth that radiated from their bodies, a living, breathing blanket against the biting chill. It was a symbiotic relationship, a dance of desperate survival where every warm breath counted. The act of bringing Brunhilda inside was a slow, arduous process. You opened the hut's small, crude door wide, allowing a fresh, biting gust of wind to sweep through the room, making Finn shiver. Thorn coaxed Brunhilda forward, gently tugging at a rope around her neck. Her hooves scraped on the frozen ground, and her massive body lumbered through the narrow opening, filling the doorway like a moving mountain. The moment she was inside, the familiar, comforting scent of wood smoke was immediately, irrevocably replaced by the overwhelming, earthy odor of cow manure and wet fur. It was a smell that clung to everything, a second skin to the very air, a constant reminder of your new four-legged houseguest. Brunhilda settled in a corner, as far from the hearth as possible, yet still close enough for her significant body heat to radiate outwards. She breathed in slow, deliberate sighs, her breath a warm, steaming plume in the frigid air of the hut. The presence of such a large animal was transformative. You could almost feel the temperature rise by a fractional degree, a tiny victory in the relentless war against the cold. The very air around her seemed to shimmer with the heat she gave off. And her body, a vast expanse of rough brindle fur, was a powerful heat source. Your ancestors, people whispered, used to call them living stoves, believing their warmth was a gift from the earth itself. But living with a cow, even a docile one like Brunhilda, came with its own challenges. The smell was persistent, cloying, a constant assault on your senses. You found yourself becoming accustomed to it, breathing shallowly through your nose, but there was no escaping its pervasive presence. And then there was the waste. Brunhilda, being a cow, produced copious amounts of manure. You had to regularly scoop it up, a foul-smelling chore that you performed with a grim determination, using a crude wooden shovel and a bucket. The feel of the cold, slimy dung on your hands, even through your thin gloves, was a visceral reminder of your grim reality. It was a task performed multiple times a day, a necessary evil to keep the floor somewhat clean, or at least passable. Finn, surprisingly, was fascinated by Brunhilda. He would often approach her cautiously, his hand outstretched, gently stroking her coarse fur. The texture was rough, surprisingly stiff, like thick, matted straw. Brunhilda, for her part, seemed to tolerate his small investigations with a placid indifference, her large, dark eyes blinking slowly. Sometimes, to your amazement, Finn would curl up beside her, his small body pressed against her warm flank, and drift off to sleep, feeling her gentle, rhythmic breathing, a lullaby of life. You would watch them, a study of contrasts, the tiny, vulnerable human child and the enormous, placid beast, both seeking solace in each other's warmth. This unexpected companionship was a small, precious jewel in the harsh landscape of your life.
Your other livestock, though smaller, also played their part. A few chickens, their plumes like small, ruffled clouds, would often roost on the crude wooden beams overhead, their soft clucking and cooing a constant, quiet backdrop to your life. Sometimes, one would lose its footing and land with a flurry of feathers on the floor, startling everyone before flapping back to its perch like a clumsy spirit. A single pig, a large, grunting sow, was kept in a small, fenced-off section near the hut's entrance. Its snores and grunts, a chorus of contentment, often punctuated the quiet nights, and its constant rooting and sifting through the straw added to the pervasive, earthy smell. Even their small, individual heats contributed to the overall warmth of the hut, turning your dwelling into a multi-species warmth factory.
People whispered that those who didn't bring their animals inside often found their toes frozen solid in the morning, a grim reality of the winter's bite. One evening, a heart-stopping moment occurred. You had left a wooden bucket of precious meltwater-filled water near the corner where Brunhilda was resting. In her sleep, or perhaps a restless shift, the cow nudged it. The bucket tipped, sending a small cascade of icy water across the packed dirt floor, spreading outwards like a malignant stain. Your breath caught in your throat. Water, in this freezing environment, was a deadly enemy. It would quickly turn to ice, creating a treacherous, slippery patch and amplifying the cold from the earth. "Thorn!" you cried, your voice a sharp command that cut through the hut's dim quiet. Both of you scrambled, grabbing old cloths, anything to soak up the water before it could freeze solid. Your fingers grew numb almost instantly as they touched the icy puddle, a cold kiss of warning. You worked with frantic speed, your movements a blur of desperate efficiency, until every last drop was absorbed, the small crisis averted. It was a stark reminder that even your four-legged furnace could present unexpected, dangerous challenges. People whispered that deep down these animals understood their role, not just as providers of food and labor, but as silent protectors against the cold. They were unwitting guardians, their very existence intertwined with your own. Perhaps it was a comforting fiction, a story you told yourselves to make the inconvenience bearable. But as you looked at Brunhilda, placidly chewing her cud, radiating warmth, you couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. She was a living monument to your shared survival, a powerful ally against the relentless forces of winter. Only these ancient mud-daubed walls knew how many nights families had sheltered, relying on the warmth of these unthinking creatures. They were the silent witnesses to 1,000 such evenings, to countless peasants pressing their bodies against the warm hides of their animals, finding solace and survival in the shared breath. This reliance, this interdependence, was a sacred bond, forged in the crucible of harsh winters. A secret buried deep beneath the sands of time was this profound, humbling truth, the mutual dependence between human and beast, a relationship born not of sentimentality, but of sheer, brutal necessity. As the nights grew longer and the wind howled with increasing ferocity, the subtle presence of Brunhilda became not just tolerable, but comforting. Her slow, rhythmic breathing was a steady bass note in the symphony of your shared survival, a reassuring presence in the profound darkness. You'd wake in the night, shivering, and simply stretching a hand out to touch her warm flank brought a surprising sense of security, a tether to life in the swirling cold. This journey through winter was a constant lesson in adaptation, in finding warmth and life in the most unexpected places. And in your small, cramped hut, filled with the smells of earth, smoke, and animal, Brunhilda was a silent sentinel, her generous warmth a constant reminder that even in the darkest, coldest times, life, in its most primal form, found a way to endure.
The gnawing began subtly, a whispering rodent in the pit of your stomach, but by mid-morning it had escalated into a full-blown roar, a hungry beast trapped within your belly. It was the unmistakable symphony of starvation, a torment far more insidious than the biting cold. Your family's meager larder, a cruel joke of abundance, was dwindling at an alarming rate. The shelves that once held hopeful stacks of dried vegetables and cured meats, now looking like a skeletal grin. You knelt before it, staring at the diminishing piles of dried turnips and oats, your heart a stone sinking in a cold well. Another week? Perhaps 2? And then what? The very thought was a cold dread creeping up your spine, a foreboding shadow that swallowed the meager light from your hearth. This wasn't just about feeling hungry. It was about the slow, agonizing dance with oblivion, watching your very substance waste away, knowing that soon the choice would no longer be yours to make. Finn, his small hand instinctively clutching his stomach, coughed weakly, a dry, brittle sound that shattered your resolve. You knew the source of his weakness wasn't just the cold, but the relentless, insidious bite of hunger that was gnawing at his very core. This was a daily torment, a constant reminder of your desperate plight, a struggle far more intimate and terrifying than the distant howls of the wind. Your reserves, once a beacon of security, were now a mocking illusion, their rapid depletion a terrifying countdown to a future you dared not contemplate. For the medieval peasant, winter was not just a season of cold, it was a season of profound scarcity, a time when the very earth seemed to turn its back on you. The fertile fields lay fallow, buried beneath a shroud of ice and snow, their bounty a distant memory. Survival hinged entirely on the foresight and labor of the warmer months, on the food you had painstakingly cultivated, harvested, and preserved. Your diet was a monotonous, yet vital, collection of basics. Root vegetables, like dried turnips and parsnips, their earthy scent a constant presence in your hut. Potatoes, a more recent and less common arrival in some parts of Europe, were a rare treasure if you had them, providing precious starch. And then there were the grains, barley and oats, humble but life-sustaining, the very lifeblood of your existence, often ground into coarse flour or used to thicken watery porridges. These were the staples, the very scaffolding of your survival. Meals were not about flavor or variety, but about calories, pure, unadulterated energy to fuel your body's desperate fight against the insidious chill. You ate to generate warmth, each mouthful a small act of defiance against the insidious chill that sought to drain your life force. The concept of eating for pleasure was a luxurious fantasy, a whispered dream for distant lords in their heated castles. For you, food was a grim medicine, a necessary fuel for the machine of your body. The crisis unfolding in your larder was stark. Despite your careful rationing, despite every desperate measure, the food stores were depleting faster than a melting snowdrift in spring. You would stand before the shelves, your breath misting in the cold air, feeling the hollow ache in your belly, trying to reconcile the dwindling piles with the endless stretch of winter still ahead. The once plump sacks of oats now lay limp and pathetic, their contents reduced to a precious few handfuls. The dried turnips, shriveled and hard, were like ancient relics from a time of imagined plenty. Each morning, preparing the meager meals felt like a ritual of sacrifice. For Finn especially, the portion was heartbreakingly small, a mere handful of thin porridge, a watery ghost of a meal, barely enough to quell the immediate pangs of hunger. You would watch him, his small face concentrated on each spoonful, wishing you could conjure more, wishing you could fill his small stomach to bursting. Your own portion was often even smaller, sacrificed in the desperate hope that his young body might withstand the harshness of the season. The constant rumbling in your stomach was a familiar companion, a persistent drumbeat of want that never truly faded. Your head often felt light, dizzy with the gnawing emptiness, your limbs heavy as leaden weights. You'd catch a glimpse of your reflection in a still puddle, your cheeks gaunt, your eyes sunken, a hollow-eyed ghost staring back. The few remaining pieces of coarse, dark bread, saved from the last milling, were hard as stones, their edges sharp and brittle. They tasted of nothing but desperation, a grim reminder of easier times. You'd chew slowly, deliberately, trying to extract every last bit of sustenance, feeling the dry fragments scratch at your throat. These weren't loaves of soft, fresh bread, but rather skeletal remains of what once promised nourishment, now stripped bare of any comfort or joy. The sight of them, so unappetizing yet so vital, was a daily torment, a constant battle between desire and grim necessity.
Then came the conversation you dreaded, a shadow puppet show of painful choices. Thorn, his voice weakened by fever but his mind still sharp, looked at the remaining livestock with a grim calculation in his eyes. There was Bruno, your stout little pig, still grunting with a hopeful, if slightly diminished, vigor. He was young,
not yet fully grown, and you had hoped to keep him until spring, perhaps even breed him to expand your meager stock. He was a symbol of future prosperity, a living investment in a better tomorrow. "The pig, Elara," Thorn said, his voice quiet yet firm as winter ice. "He's eating our stores. Better to slaughter him now while there's still enough to cure the meat than to watch him starve later." His words were a dagger to your heart. You stared at Bruno, rooting innocently in his small pen, his tail wagging with a pathetic enthusiasm as he sniffed at a stray kernel of grain. To kill him now felt like a betrayal, a violent severing of a tenuous thread of future hope. He was a creature of life, a promise of growth, and sacrificing him felt like cannibalizing your own future. You hesitated, your mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The meat from a young pig, while a feast now, would not last the entire winter. It would postpone the inevitable, perhaps by a few weeks, but at what cost? What would you do when the meat was gone? What hope would you have for a future harvest without a healthy pig to help fertilize the fields? The thought of Finn, his small frame growing thinner with each passing day, eventually broke your resolve. His survival was paramount, a sacred duty that outweighed any future hope. We will do it," you managed to choke out, the words tasting like ash on your tongue. The decision was made, brutal and final, a grim decree handed down by the relentless hand of hunger. The act itself was a blur of grim efficiency, a necessary cruelty performed with a heavy heart. The squeals, brief and terrifying, were soon silenced, replaced by the profound, unsettling stillness of death. As you worked, preparing the meat, your hands raw and stained, you felt the weight of the choice. A brand burned into your soul. This meat, though grisly, was a gift, a sacrifice, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing bite of starvation. It would provide the precious calories, the raw energy to fuel your bodies and keep the warmth flickering within you. People whispered that some winters were so harsh they forced folk to consume tree bark, even the very roots of the earth, just to cling to life. Stories of such desperation were shared in hushed tones around dying fires, their grim details acting as both a warning and a testament to the sheer, unyielding will to survive. These were not just tales, they were blueprints for extreme measures, survival guides written in the bitter ink of experience. You thought of them now as you carved the last meager portion of pig meat, wondering if such extreme measures would be your own fate before this merciless winter finally released its icy grip. A secret buried deep beneath the sands of time was the chilling truth that sometimes life was bought with the cruelest of choices. The decision to sacrifice one form of life for another, to consume hope for immediate survival, was a universal, brutal reality for those who lived on the edge of subsistence. It was a stark reminder that in the medieval world, morality often bent to the undeniable will of hunger, a tyrant more absolute than any king. As the days blended into a monotonous cycle of cold, hunger, and brief precious warmth from the dwindling fire, you continued to ration, to stretch every morsel of food as far as it could possibly go. The thin porridge grew thinner, the hard bread even harder. Each meal a meditation on scarcity. Your senses became heightened. Every smell of food, however faint, became a powerful magnet. Every rustle of dry leaves sounding like a squirrel hoarding nuts. The cold might numb your fingers, but hunger was a constant burning pain, a fire in your belly that no amount of wood could extinguish. This journey was teaching you that true desperation wasn't found in grand battles, but in the quiet daily fight against the pervasive, agonizing bite of hunger, a silent tormentor that stalked your every waking moment.
The air crackled with a strange, nervous energy, a palpable tension that hummed beneath the surface of your village. Weeks of bone-chilling cold and gnawing hunger had left their mark, but a fragile hope, delicate as a snowflake, had begun to bloom. The approach of the midwinter festival. It was meant to be a rare beacon, a tiny sun in the endless night of winter, a fleeting moment of communal solace before the harsh season dug its claws in even deeper. Preparations were underway, hushed whispers of meager feasts and borrowed candles weaving through the village like threads of fragile light. Then, on the eve of the festival, the sky, which had been a dull slate gray, suddenly turned a terrifying bruised purple, a portent of doom. The wind, hitherto a mere complaint, began to howl with a new maniacal fury, a screaming banshee tearing at the very fabric of the world. This wasn't just a storm, it was an apocalypse of ice and wind, a brutal, unforeseen disaster far more powerful than any Thorn had ever recounted, a monster unleashed from the darkest depths of winter's heart. A sudden, deafening crack ripped through the air like a giant's axe splitting the world in two, followed by a horrific tearing sound. Your mud and stick hut, your flimsy birdcage against the elements, groaned in protest, then surrendered. A massive section of your straw roof was violently torn away by the wind's invisible, ravenous claws, flung into the swirling white chaos. Snow and wind, sharp as razor blades, immediately surged inside, invading your sanctuary like a horde of frozen demons. The struggling fire in the hearth, your smoldering heart, flickered desperately, almost snuffed out by the sudden icy draft. Brunhilda, your old cow, let out a terrified bellow, a primeval scream of pure fear that vibrated through your bones. Thin, whimpering, burrowed deeper into your arms, his small body trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. Panic, cold and swift as a mountain torrent, seized your throat. This was the moment. This was the final brutal test of everything you had learned, everything you had endured. "The roof! Elara, the roof!" Thorn cried, his voice raw with urgency as he struggled to rise, his feverish weakness battling against his desperate will. The gaping hole above was a hungry mouth, devouring any semblance of warmth, any illusion of safety. Snow lashed inwards, stinging your skin like tiny frozen needles, accumulating rapidly on the packed dirt floor, turning it into a gleaming white death trap. The wind, no longer content to merely rattle the walls, seemed to reach in, icy fingers searching for vulnerable flesh. You knew, with a terrifying clarity, that without immediate action, you would all be lost, swallowed whole by the raging blizzard. Your mind, usually methodical, became a whirlwind of desperate thought, sifting through every hard-won lesson, every whispered secret of survival you had gathered throughout this brutal journey. This was the moment to apply them all, to weave them into a single desperate tapestry of defiance. Patching the breach, you immediately sprang into action. "Thorn, Finn, move closer to the fire, as close as you can," you commanded, your voice surprisingly steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm you. Ingrid and Rolf, who had already been sheltering in your hut since their own roof had been claimed by an earlier gust, joined you in a frenzy of activity. There was no time for finesse, no time for gathering proper materials. You grabbed anything and everything available. Old, coarse blankets, a discarded piece of stiffened animal hide, a broken wooden board, even a bundle of dried reeds. Anything that could provide a temporary barrier against the relentless onslaught of snow and wind. Thorn, moving with a strength born of sheer will, used a long pole to push a large torn section of your previous roof straw back into place, a desperate, futile gesture against the storm's immense power. You and Ingrid climbed onto stools, struggling to shove the various oddities into the massive opening, pressing them against the remaining roof timbers. The wind roared around you, a deafening beast, threatening to rip the makeshift patches from your numb fingers.
Your hands quickly became raw, bleeding from splinters and frozen with cold, but you pushed on, driven by a primal need to protect your family, a burning ember of hope in the vast darkness. Each piece, however small, was a victory, a tiny flag of defiance against the monstrous storm. Protecting the hearth. The most critical battle was at the hearth. The wind, finding the gaping hole in your roof, plunged downwards, threatening to extinguish your precious fire. Thorn, despite his weakness, crawled to the pit, his body a living shield against the direct blast. He huddled over the meager flame, his face illuminated by its dying glow, murmuring encouragements to the stubbornly resistant embers. "Keep it banked, Elara," he gasped, his voice thin as a wisp of smoke. Even in this chaotic moment, he was teaching, passing on his most vital skill. You remembered his words from the other night, the sacred ritual of fire banking. You brought him handfuls of fine ash, and he, with agonizing slowness, spooned it over the struggling embers, his gnarled hands moving with an instinctive, desperate precision. The smoke, instead of escaping through the ruined roof, now swirled thicker than ever, a choking fog that filled the hut, making your eyes stream and your lungs burn. But the fire held, a stubborn heartbeat in the face of annihilation, its faint glow a powerful testament to Thorn's unyielding will. The human lasagna as a fortress. As the wind continued its assault and the snow piled higher on the floor, the only true fortress was each other. You, Finn, Thorn, Ingrid, and Rolf, along with Brunhilda, your four-legged furnace, huddled together in the innermost corner of the hut, away from the worst of the breach. You became an even tighter, denser human lasagna, a living, breathing fortress against the external cold. Finn was pressed against your chest, his small body a source of surprising warmth. Rolf, terrified, clung to Ingrid, burying his face in her rough tunic. Thorn, now barely conscious, leaned heavily against your back, his body a heavy, reassuring weight. Brunhilda, despite her earlier fright, had settled down, her massive form acting as a significant heat source, her soft breathing a deep, rumbling comfort. The combined body heat, though not enough to make you truly warm, was enough to push back against the worst of the cold, creating a small, vital pocket of survivable air. You could feel the soft, steady rhythm of each other's breaths, the occasional twitch of a muscle, the almost imperceptible shiver, all woven into a tapestry of shared vulnerability and strength.
Breathing for survival. Even amidst the chaos, a small yet vital instruction from Thorn echoed in your mind. Breathe through your nose, Elara, slow, shallow. You instinctively pulled Finn's small face against your shoulder, whispering the same command to him, forcing him to breathe in the warmer, filtered air. It was a tiny, desperate trick, a whispered prayer against the insidious chill that sought to freeze your lungs. Every inhalation felt like a miniature wound as the cold, smoky air scraped its way down your throat, but you forced yourself to follow the grim instruction, knowing it was one more small shield against the storm's deadly embrace. You felt Finn's small body tremble, but his breathing, though still shallow, seemed to grow a little less ragged. The last morsels. Hunger, a gnawing beast, had retreated for a time, replaced by the more immediate, overwhelming terror of the storm. But as the long night stretched on, its presence returned, a persistent ache in your belly. You reached into your small pouch, pulling out the last, hard, dark bread. You broke it into tiny, almost invisible pieces, distributing them among your huddled group. Each crumb was a sacred offering, a tiny nugget of life to be savored, chewed slowly, allowing every last particle of sustenance to be extracted. There was no joy in this meal, only a grim resolve, a silent acknowledgement that this too was a part of the battle. The taste was dry, earthy, a flavor of desperation, but each mouthful brought a minuscule yet vital surge of energy, a flicker of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. The night became an eternity. The wind howled relentlessly, 1,000 demons shrieking at your door, threatening to tear your world apart. The sounds of your teeth chattering were a constant rhythmic counterpoint to the storm's fury, a nervous percussion that seemed to echo in the very marrow of your bones. Your fear for Finn was a physical pain, a hot, burning knot in your chest that transcended the cold. You held him tighter, willing your own warmth into his small form, whispering meaningless reassurances into his hair. There were moments, stretching into agonizing eternity, when you truly believed you wouldn't survive, when the very thought of dawn seemed like an impossible, cruel fantasy. You could feel the edges of despair closing in, a cold, suffocating blanket threatening to smother your last vestiges of hope. Then, just as the darkness seemed absolute, and eternity without end, a miracle. A subtle shift in the wind's howl, a faint, almost imperceptible lightening at the edges of your makeshift windows, and then a profound, blessed silence, a sudden startling absence of the storm's roar. Slowly, cautiously, you crawled to the entrance. The wooden door, though battered and scarred, still held. You pushed it open, and the sight that greeted you stole your breath. The storm was gone. The sky was an impossible, crystalline blue, a vast, serene expanse that mocked the previous night's fury. But the world below was transformed. Everything was buried beneath a thick, pristine blanket of snow, higher than your head in places, its surface sparkling like 1,000,000 scattered diamonds under the weak, nascent sun. Your hut, though still standing, looked battered, crooked, a brave but wounded soldier in a vast white battlefield. You turned back to your family, huddled together, still breathing, still alive. Finn was asleep, a peaceful, trusting weight in your arms. Thorn, though still weak, had a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. Ingrid and Rolf were stirring, their eyes blinking in the dim light. The midwinter festival, that distant dream of celebration, had not happened. But as you looked at the weary, sleeping faces around you, at the faint glow from the rekindled hearth, you realized that the true festival, the most profound celebration of all, had just ended. It was the festival of survival, a testament to the unyielding spirit of humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. This was a story of resilience, a secret buried deep beneath the sands of time, that even in the most brutal cold, hope, like a resilient ember, could be kept warm by the indomitable fire of human will. You felt Finn's warm breath against your cheek, and a single, silent tear, hot and defiant, traced a path down your cold face, not from the chill, but from the profound, quiet victory of simply existing. Thank you for joining us on this journey to uncover the harsh, yet extraordinary survival secrets of the Middle Ages. We hope the story of Elara and the resilient peasants touched your heart. Please leave a comment about what resonated with you most. Like this video to let us know you want to see more, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next historical adventures. See you again soon.